everybody. I'm Aaron Simmons. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president of the Soren Kierkegaard Society, USA. I am here to ask you a few questions. Do you ever find yourself struggling with who you're becoming? Wrestling with how to be a Christian in the context of a church that is really, really hard to navigate? Do you find yourself trying your best to live faithfully and yet struggling with a world that says all that really matters is external success? Well, if you say yes to any of those questions, then I've got the class for you. Tripp Fuller and I are going to be doing a 6-week intensive course on the work of Soren Kierkegaard. It's called Getting Lost and Finding Faith, Walking with Kierkegaard. Because as we know, getting lost sucks. But getting lost is also usually what allows us to discover things we otherwise might have missed along the way. So maybe we need to get lost more in order to rethink who we are, and where we're trying to go. It matters that we take seriously what everybody else takes for granted. And in this class, we're going to unpack Kierkegaard, this melancholy Danish thinker, but who was fully invested in what it means to live well, what it means to struggle toward becoming, and what it means to love God in a world where the name of God is often not more than just a way of reinforcing our own social power. An influence on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, an influence on other thinkers who have helped us reconsider who we are and why it matters to think through these questions so carefully. I hope you'll join us. I can't wait to think with you and learn from you. It's going to be a lot of fun. Take care. We'll see you online soon.
What is up, theology nerds? This is Tripp, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, where since the year of 2008, we've been bringing you nuggets of ideological goodness. That's my alternative label for podcast episodes, with some of the best scholars, theologians, philosophers, scientists, biblical scholars, trying to bring all the zest out of the academy and plop it in your earbuds, and guess what? You don't have to take out student loans. But anyway, I've been doing this for a long time, and sometimes, I have a New Testament scholar on, and I talk to them about New Testament theology. It starts to creep in, and then it's like, how does a New Testament Bible scholar deal with someone wanting to make specific theological claims? That happens in this, but more than that, you get to hear me talking to one of the fellow faculty members at the University of Edinburgh. This is Matthew Novidson. He's a senior lecturer in New Testament and Christian origins. He's a really kind, fun guy to talk to hang out with, and hopefully it'll come out on this podcast. You'll say to yourself, "Oh, Tripp actually likes this guy," and I can see why someone would want to go study with him. And he's kind of a smart fellow. Well, I hope you enjoy it. It was a blast. Here we go. It is Matthew Novidson. I hope you enjoy it. Hello, everybody. This is Tripp, and I am here with my colleague at the University of Edinburgh, Matthew Novidson. So how are you doing today, Matt?
Yeah, pretty good, Tripp. Pretty good. Well, it's not a sunny day in Edinburgh, but it's all right.
Yeah, I would not call it sunny. It's moist. And, a whole bunch of people just turned the podcast off. If you use the word moist, people turn the podcast off. It's like saying Alexa. But, oh well. So, normally in a non-COVID time, we'd actually get to hang out in person. So I've now decided to simulate personal interactions with other people on staff by having them on the podcast. And that gets to, spread the disciplines around. You are a scholar of Second Temple period Judaism and the New Testament and Jesus and Messianism. And you got a book on Paul coming out. So how does an American end up, one, getting in love with the scholarship and ending up in Scotland?
Yeah. Well, maybe it's a bit like your experience. I don't know. I mean, because, you and I similarly too, Americans who've ended up in Edinburgh. I mean, in my case, it all just, I mean, I'm thrilled with how it turned out, but it kind of unfolded in unexpected ways. So I had finished my PhD and was looking for a tenure track job. Ideally, what I was hoping for was something in a kind of research department like this, where I could teach undergrads and grad students, and also get to write books and stuff like that. I did a year and a half as like contingent faculty, and here our backgrounds overlapped a bit. I was in Raleigh, North Carolina, taught at NC State for a year, and then taught for a semester at Duke Divinity, just on sort of short-term contracts. And then a job in Edinburgh opened up, and I'd been to the UK as a tourist before, but I hadn't lived or studied here. But it was one of those, really attractive jobs that came up. I put an application in and had a really very fast, very intense interview process, the way they do things here in the UK. And we found ourselves moving in Edinburgh, my wife having never set foot in the UK before. So yeah, it all came together, and we're happy with how it worked out.
So when was it that your kind of research interest and stuff first emerged?
During grad school, I guess. So my PhD thesis, which then became my first book, was on the word Christ in the letters of Paul, and it was a kind of mashup of Pauline studies, Pauline theology kind of questions, and then Jewish studies, like a sort of look at Messianism in the Second Temple and early rabbinic periods. It was a kind of perfect accident of two seminars I did as a grad student, one of them on Pauline theology and one on ancient Jewish Messianism, one of them in the Princeton Seminary faculty and one in the Jewish Studies faculty at the university. And sort of at the exact point where those two things overlapped, I dug out a PhD thesis. And then that sort of, I mean, since then I've done more on Paul and New Testament stuff, and then more on Jewish Messianism and other like ancient Jewish ideas about the Messiah and angels and demons and other kind of, superhuman beings, and the way those things line up with early Christology. So, yeah.
So, one of the things that people experience pretty often when they've grown up and only had a relationship to biblical text through their religious tradition, as they find out, well, these texts are not the only ones we have from that historical period, that the layers of interpretation your particular denomination or tradition has its own theological intuitions that have mediate the text. And so there's always tensions that come up when someone realizes, right, that Paul's in a conversation in a period of time and is not the only voice. And our version of Paul might have a little more, Lutheran flavoring on top than he, historically had. And these type of questions. So like when you think of introducing the critical study of the New Testament to people that have only encountered it in kind of congregational or confessional context, what are some of the big ideas that might be initially off-putting, but when you learn them and wrestle with them, make the text come alive in different ways?
Yeah, my experience would kind of map onto the way you posed the question, I guess. And that I think before graduate school, I hadn't really read. I mean, the Bible I knew was mostly a Protestant Bible. Some of my family are Catholic, so I was sort of broadly aware of the books of the Maccabees and Sirach, Ben Sira, and so on. But I mean,
and the dragon. Come on,
yeah.
There's a dragon in the Catholic Bible. That's why J.R. Tolkien was Catholic. I don't know if that's ever been researched, but it should have been. Anyway, sorry to interrupt you, Ryan. It's like just told it. Dragon.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, reading extra canonical stuff outside the canon that one happens to know is like really mind expanding, right? And that mostly for me, I mean, it was in graduate school I started to do that. And so, I mean, with students or just, friends, people that I talk to, if it gets to talking about the kind of weird stuff that I work on, I mean, one thing I'll do with students is, have them read for the first time something like Tobit or Bel and the Dragon or the Parables of Enoch or something like that. But also, I mean, when reading Paul, one thing I like to do with students that mirrors some of my experience reading Paul is, rather than start with with the passages or the phrases that are most familiar to us, right, to going to justification by faith or sin coming into the world through Adam or things like that. I mean, even the letters of Paul are already full of kind of aporia, little weird bits that even within a familiar canonical Bible, we don't really know what to do with, right? So I'm teaching a beginning class on Paul right now in Edinburgh, and I'll start with something like 1 Corinthians 11 and the women veiling their heads while prophesying because of the angels. What is it about angels and veils? I'm of the view that this is actually really closely related to the story of the Watchers in First Enoch, and so on, again, which takes us instantly beyond familiar Protestant Bibles, although the roots of that are right there in the book of Genesis too. Or talk about baptism for the dead in 1 Corinthians 15, right? There's clearly some ritual there that was important to them and that Paul takes for granted as a legit thing, and that, for the most part, most of the Christian churches don't do and don't know exactly what it is, right? So I find it really helpful just to defamiliarize even the texts we already think we know well, like the letters of Paul or the Gospels. So
one of the things that sticks out to me in my own experience, first encountering like biblical studies, is that so many of our New Testament texts are kind of one side of a conversation. But even in the early church conversation, Paul features so prominently in the New Testament, and the stories in Acts come later, where the kind of heated debates and things that were being worked out, whether how you deal with the Hebrew scriptures, around circumcision, but also how you deal with the presence of the Spirit of Christ in different people. There's so many ways that the kind of historical and critical engagement with the New Testament opens back up a kind of energy and intensity in that period that we experienced, I think, too often as kind of closed and final, as just some settled text.
Yeah, that's realizing that each of these authors that are now in our New Testament didn't know all the other books, right, that are all in there for us, and they didn't know that they would all be part of this collection. And it's the phenomenon that comes from a canon, that if you encounter them as part of a bound Bible, and you have certain assumptions that they sort of are all speaking together about one thing, which is, according to the canonical logic of the Christian tradition, or differently, of course, canons in Jewish tradition or others, then there's a legitimate theological logic to that. But to look at them historically is to realize, oh my goodness, Paul dies before there are any Gospels written yet. He doesn't know that all this will be there, right? He doesn't know that he'll be part of this book. And so then you can begin to see the differences, either just gaps where one, maybe doesn't know about a development that we take for granted elsewhere in another of these books, or in some cases, possibly outright disagreements over issues. And there's the famous case of whether a person is justified by faith with or without works in the letter of James and the letters of Paul. And it's not certain, but a relatively common view that the letter of James knows Paul's idiom and is going out of his way to contradict it. In a different case would be like, well, I think it's a different case. The book of Revelation has this, rails against people who allow themselves to eat meat sacrificed to idols, which Paul says, yeah, it's okay as long as you're not causing somebody else offense. Some people think Revelation is knowingly, deliberately anti-Pauline there. I think it might just have a different view about whether you can or cannot eat idol food. But that's a kind of light bulb moment, or was for me, and I think it's for a lot of people, like just learning to see that they didn't always sit together in the relation that they came to sit together, these texts that are in the New Testament, which just makes them all the more interesting, I think.
Mm-hmm. In the last, 50 years or so, there's been a big shift in New Testament studies. It gets kicked off with like E.P. Sanders and company, and thinking about the larger historical context. Could you kind of say a bit about that? Like, what kind of conversations are different today than they would be, say, 100 years ago when you get in a biblical studies seminar at New College?
Yeah, I mean, the landscape has changed a lot in New Testament and biblical studies. You would know better than I, as it has in theology too. But way more people from different backgrounds are involved in the discussion, which is a huge net gain, but also sort of troubles lots of old assumptions when, the New Testament seminar in New College 100 years ago would have been mostly Church of Scotland ministers. And now, of course, there's lots of folks who are not Church of Scotland or are not Christian at all, and who aren't clergy, but are lay people or people of other or no religious affiliation themselves. So it's become a much more non-sectarian exercise. And in New Testament studies in particular, one huge movement is, I think, has some relations to the developing story in theology after the Holocaust, right? And a post-Holocaust Christian theology reckoning with the complicitness of Christian thinkers in a really, virulent and genocidal kind of anti-Judaism. The parallel discussion in New Testament studies, and you mentioned E.P. Sanders, who's writing in the 1970s, and there are precursors to him, Christopher Stendhal especially, back already in the 50s and 60s, that are kind of soul searching as New Testament scholars and biblical interpreters, saying to what extent people who are supposedly doing, a more kind of neutral activity of commentary writing or whatever, are in fact underwriting some of the same kind of bilious anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism that you could see in some sort of early 20th century theology. And around the same time, with the rise of religious studies as a discipline in universities in the mid to late 20th century, and the growth of Jewish studies departments in universities, the interpretation of the New Testament more and more became something that Jewish scholars were leading the way in. Because, of course, right, the New Testament texts, before they all became part of this book to which Tertullian gives a name, in their own context, they're just Jewish texts, right? They're late Second Temple Jewish texts for the most part. And so while they still are, and I imagine, will always be for as long as these kind of institutions exist, studied in Christian theology faculties, all of a sudden they weren't, well, not all of a sudden, but over time, they were not the proprietary domain just of ministers and theologians who train ministers in the Church of Scotland or Church of England or whatever kind of tradition, but it was a much more public conversation and a reckoning with Christian anti-Judaism. And for New Testament scholars who are still statistically mostly Christian, but to have to answer to people from other traditions, and especially Jewish New Testament scholars, that changes the discussion drastically and for the better in a million kinds of ways. Most significantly, and here E.P. Sanders is a towering figure, right? Like making New Testament exegetes check their assumptions that such and such a biblical text, that, that the Gospels or letters of Paul, that what they're about is, criticizing some kind of a caricatured idea of a problem in Judaism that Jesus or Paul comes along to solve, which is a commonplace in lots, maybe most older New Testament scholarship in a lot of ways. And that's now, thanks to Sanders and others, rightly recognized to be just a blind spot a mile wide that was inherited from certain very common strands in the Christian tradition, this assumption that whatever Jesus and the apostles were doing, it had to be a criticism of Judaism in some way. And so this is a night and day difference from even a generation or so ago, is the realization that in their original context, these are just Jewish texts. And actually the Christianization of them in a way is a second step, a second order development.
I think that's really important. And it made me remember this time when I was on my book tour with my first book. This is a popular book about Jesus, and it kind of does New Testament historical Jesus stuff and the history of Christology and things in it. And the title was, the Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Jesus, Lord, Liar, Lunatic, or Just Freaking Awesome. And mostly because of when it goes to the titles of Jesus, when you're in Christendom, and the kind of questions of anti-Judaism aren't there, and when the cacophony of other texts in Second Temple period Judaism aren't there, and you assume the theological conclusions of Nicaea and project them in your hermeneutics onto the New Testament, then obviously Jesus said he was the second person in the Trinity, eternal Son, and so either he's lying, crazy, or Lord. So like, what's the deal? And in the book, I was trying to introduce all this different critical scholarship as assets to hold your faith deeply, but in an open and critical way, in a different way. So, I thought I had this, masterful 40-minute talk that sets up Q&A, and it's at different breweries and stuff as I'm going around when the book came out. I get done. One time this guy raises his hand and he goes, Mr. Fuller. And, I always assume if they don't use doctor or reverend, you're already in trouble, Yeah. Now, Mr. Fuller, do you think Jesus Christ needed you to write this book? And I was like, I hope not. And I'm hoping that cuts it off. And he goes, it seems like you spent the whole time. Now, I'm not going to buy your book and I'm not going to read it, but it seems like you spent the whole time just not acknowledging that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. And I'm like, okay. I was like, I can't really go into this now, but Jesus's last name is not Christ. And it's kind of referring to Messiah. Like, Messiah is a title. It has its own history and lineage, not always used about Jesus. And he's thoroughly Jewish, right? Then it gets connected to Jesus, but it takes on its own tone and history. And so, I don't even know how to answer your question right now, but maybe you should get a N.T. Wright and Marcus Borg book and talk to them about it. I don't know, but I feel like those type of questions come up. So this is my story to set up for you to talk about Messiah, because you've written 2 different books on it and talked about it. And I just feel like the conversation both in the Second Temple period Judaism and then how it gets picked up and used in the Grammar of Faith are both fascinating conversations. In your books, you don't tell your own kind of personal side to it that I'd be fascinated about, right? So as someone who grew up and already had a relationship with the scriptures and with Jesus as the Christ, how did that intellectual quest get reshape how you hold the confession of Jesus as the Christ as a person? Because I think some people initially hear it as a threat. And what I was hoping to do in that book, a guy did not appreciate it, was to go these are awesome. It actually can help you. and I felt some of the same energy in yours, but obviously it's written in a, peer-reviewed academic study, not summarizing cool insights with inappropriate religious jokes beside it, which is what I was doing.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. It illustrates how Messiah is a fascinating word, even in modern, our sort of commonplace usage, because obviously, Christians of different stripes will use it in a certain way about Jesus, but not always necessarily meaning the same thing by it, right? That guy was trying to put you in your place somehow by sort of saying, don't Jesus is the Messiah or something like that. But of course, the word is pre-Christian and it still has wide currency outside Christianity. It's a very active religious term in Jewish circles of different stripes, but it also kind of takes on a life of its own, right? So in recent public discourse back in yours and my home country, the term would be thrown around for and against, critically or whatever about, Donald Trump supporters' willingness to use it of him, right? That I'm old enough to remember the first President Obama's first term where there was similar kinds of commentary about whether his followers think he's a Messiah or not. So but it's a kind of, one of those words people use because it lands with a punch, but it's often unclear exactly what's meant by it. And that's true in the ancient texts as well. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It's often used in kind of partisan ways, either by the fans or by the opponents of a certain figure. So, we kind of know that. Even lay Christians, tend to know that that's an issue in the case of Jesus, because there are stories in the Gospels about, in the Gospel of John, he often has the crowd say, how can this guy be the Messiah? Because he's from Galilee and the Messiah is supposed to come from Bethlehem. Or the high priest asks Jesus if he's the Christ, right? Peter tells Jesus that he's the Christ. There's debate about it already in biblical texts. We're kind of aware of that as an issue. One of these light bulb moments that I had back as a graduate student working on this for the first time goes back to this issue of reading extra canonical stuff. Was the first time I read and then got into what turns out to be a whole there's a whole body of ancient texts about this Jewish Messiah from the early 2nd century CE, AD, whose name was Simon Bar Kokhba or something like that, but it's called the Bar Kokhba Revolt. And it turns out that in later, I mean, he's mentioned already in some Christian texts by Justin Martyr, for instance, very early, but in the rabbinic literature, there's some really interesting stories where different sages argue about whether he was the Messiah or not. And with similar kinds of arguments for and against that you sometimes see in the Gospels and then in some early Christian literature like Justin, pointing to certain scriptural texts saying, see, this proves that he's the guy, or this other one proves that he's not the guy. And reading those was kind of an epiphany for me, because I realized this is the kind of argument that happens in the sources when you have somebody like we know very well with the case of Jesus, because there's an enormous amount of literature about him, but also in the still well documented, but much less so case of Bar Kokhba. And there were other figures as well who just haven't left a literary imprint where there's these kind of arguments, right, between their friends and their foes. And the ammunition for those arguments is pointing to texts in the Hebrew Bible, in scripture, to say, well, he's like King David in this way, but he's not in this way. So he can or can't be that guy.
Do you think, so the concept Messiah, you see it emerge through the history of Israel in the Hebrew scriptures. Where would you point to kind of its first emergence? And are there particular points in the history of the concept that it, develops or gets a type of inertia that then it gets applied in Second Temple period Judaism to particular figures that are, building communities, type of, revivals of Judaism and such?
Yeah, I came to think, after spending a lot of time on this in the research for my second book, that I don't think that one can kind of trace a very neat kind of line in the history of the development of the concept. Instead, I think what happens is, so you get the term Messiah, anointed, which in Greek is just Christ, of course, right? I mean, this is one thing, you and I know this, a lot of people know this, but if you only see it in an English Bible, it can be confusing, because in the New Testament, they'll print Christ, whereas in the Hebrew Bible, they might print Messiah or anointed, but it's the same word. Like if you read the Bible, if you read the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish scriptures in Greek, right? The Greek Old Testament, which is what our New Testament writers had, when they talk about King David, they call him the Christos, the Christ, the anointed. So I concluded that term is used in a handful of different ways. It's not super common or prominent. It's not like a main theme of the Old Testament, of the Jewish scriptures, but it's, it shows up in enough places. They tend to cluster, especially around the monarchy and the house of King David, and so on. There's also a number of references to anointed priests where it's the same word, right? The priest Messiah, literally the anointed priest. And there are a few other instances where it might relate to prophets or maybe angelic figures, depending how you read certain passages in Daniel. But I think the whole Second Temple period and then onward, right, is kind of the story of anywhere that those terms showed up in the scriptures in the Old Testament, then early Jewish and Christian interpreters felt free to sort of use them in those kinds of ways, right? So if you were a priest yourself or a Levite or from kind of those circles, then, and we know there's some examples of this at Qumran, right? That your hero, your ideal kind of figure might be a priest. In the eschaton, in the ideal future, the best world you can imagine is one where the right people are running the temple and the right rituals are being conducted and sacrifices are being offered. And if that's as good as it gets, right? To have proper liturgy restored in the temple. If you're a layperson,
it's probably hard these days to get people to think that people's eschatological hopes had to do with a priest.
Yeah,
but just remember, there was a time.
Yeah, well, no. Read some Dead Sea Scrolls. Like for some people, nothing would be better than a perfectly run temple cult. In other instances, and the better known ones, then the Messiah is some kind of military or royal figure. And these are mostly patterned after the stories of David, I think, for the most part. That's why he has an outsized influence on this. And so you get, text kind of imagining an eschatological Davidic king, a son of David, who will sort things out. And what's interesting from the New Testament side is that's the main. The title Messiah gets attached to Jesus very early in the tradition, apparently, and it is almost always of this royal type, and that's a really weird mismatch because, and he gets executed from a Roman perspective, apparently for being some kind of royal pretender, right? But of course, in the stories in the Gospels, he doesn't mostly do royal stuff. He heals people, and he's an exorcist, and he teaches, but he doesn't actually do the kind of things that other, would-be royal messiahs get crucified for. He does not, for the most part, seem to have, he's not building an army or something like that. So that's a real puzzle in the case of Jesus. And then there are, though, the exceptions that prove the rules, right? I mean, I spent some time with the Epistle to the Hebrews is one of the funniest ones in the New Testament this way, because, he really desperately, Hebrews, more than anything else, well, it's kind of like what I was describing before, where, people whose eschatological hope is the perfect priesthood. It's kind of Hebrews' view. And yet Hebrews is stuck with the fact that across the tradition, Jesus was supposed to have been a Davidite. So he's like, how does this work? He's a Davidite, but I need him to be a priest. So Hebrews appeals to Melchizedek, which is this ingenious move that lets Jesus be both a Davidic Messiah, but also a priest. So the bottom line of all that, in response to your original question about how studying all this stuff makes me think about the Christian confession that Jesus is the Christ, is that, it's very complicated. That confession, even within the Christian tradition, doesn't mean just one thing. And while it's a good and important Christian thing to say, I mean, it's interesting, is you mentioned the 4th century creeds, for which actually the confession that Jesus is the Christ that's not one of they're not concerned to have that fight, actually, right? They need to say that he's,
it's just kind of assumed,
the Father and so on. Yeah. But they've moved, they're fighting other battles entirely. Whereas if you read Justin in the 2nd century, or if you read the Gospels, it's that he's the Messiah. That's what they care about. And the language, of course, John has some, divine equality language there. But for the most part, the kind of stuff that the 4th century creeds are concerned about, wanting to say about Jesus, is a very different set of stuff, right? I mean, I suppose I would have shared a kind of unthinking view inherited from some kind of, Christian environment, that to say Jesus was the Messiah is to say he's the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity or something. And that's not the case at all, right? I mean,
so you're saying the other messiahs people talk about are not part of the Trinity? Because once you start saying that there are other messiahs, then you just wonder, are we even Trinitarians anymore?
Yeah. The title Son of God, I think, is the thin thread that kind of gets you from one to the other. But no, to say Jesus the Messiah is just it's a very different ball of wax than to say that he's homoousios with the Father or whatever.
Do you think? Knowing how theologian thinks based on what you said, I wonder if this is one of the most annoying questions you get asked, right? So even when you talk about the different places, the text, the kind of constellation of images in the Hebrew tradition where the anointed one, Messiah and stuff comes up, you get ones that are connected to prophet, priest, and king. And it's much later in church history that those 3 offices, right, get applied to thinking through the person of Jesus. But one of the things I notice in your work is, that's convenient, if you're trying to teach Christian doctrine or whatever, but even each of those strands of prophet, priest, and king, if you were trying to pin it down, right, and apply it to one person as the perfect example of each, that maneuver is problematic, right? To essentialize the title and apply it to one. What do you think is going on when you get these kind of different threads of uses, and how does that kind of cacophony of different text traditions and uses shift how you understand the confession of Jesus as the Christ in the New Testament and in the life of the early church?
I think what happens is there's a dominant, but not universal, it's not an impulse in the Christian tradition in the main to stick with the words of that confession, because it's there so early and across all 4 of the canonical Gospels, at least, right, to say that Jesus is the Christ. So there becomes a kind of Christian intuition, I think, that to be able to say that is important. But then what happens is that claim, that confession, often unwittingly, maybe. It's not as if there's like a sort of a plan or a conspiracy to do this or something. But I think the tradition says, okay, it's important that Christians be able to say Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah. But in fact, later generations and different corners, different places in the Christian tradition are actually concerned to make very different claims about Jesus. But what they'll do is they'll still use that original claim to mean something else, to mean whatever it is that they're really invested in, right? To say that he's the second person of the Godhead, or that whole the munus triplex thing, the prophet, priest, king. I mean, I don't know when that comes about exactly. I should know. I think at one point I have known, but I don't presently. But I mean, that has a kind of surface mapping with biblical language about messiahs, but it's not at all. It's not like there are precisely three kinds of messiahs and those are them. Nor is it the case that like any one messiah is usually all three of those. The first person who's all three get attached to David at some point. I think the first person who's actually called all three is one of the Hasmonean priest kings in the 2nd century BCE. But basically that becomes something in a kind, it's not, I'm going to say arbitrary, which is not quite the right word, but in a very contingent way, that becomes important to certain parts of the Christian tradition to be able to say that. And so they say, well, that's what we mean by saying that Jesus is the Christ. Although that's not what it meant originally, right? Likewise with the idea, like in your story about the guy who posed the hostile question to you, whatever exactly he meant by wanting to insist that don't you know Jesus is the Messiah, for him, that's probably a way of saying that Jesus is, something really important that I'm insisting on saying here. And rhetorically it works, right? To say that means Messiah. So it's often a matter, I think, of kind of keeping your eye on the ball, so to speak, right? And watching, okay, what's at stake in this particular debate? What is it that this person is, or this part of the tradition is wanting to claim? And then how are they joining that up with the very, very ancient title of Messiah? And then it's interesting that in something like the Nicene Creed, in a way, their cards are on the table because that's not a claim that they want to make, actually, right? And you'd think someone like Justin might be scandalized by that, right? Because they could say, God of God, light of light, very God of very God, none of which is pertinent in a way to the kind of Jewish Christian controversy that Justin's having back in the 2nd century. So it illustrates, I guess, the cacophony, as you say. It illustrates the way that we've inherited that term as something really, really crucial, but it continues to be sort of just injected with content as needed, depending on the debate that is on the table at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Just even in the canonized New Testament, not just all the texts you get from that didn't make and such in the early church, but it seems to be that if you look at what even the 4 evangelists of the Gospels, Paul, that kind of stuff, are thinking about theologically, when it even just goes to something like the person of Christ, you get a multiplicity of Christologies, and often the kind of particularity of each voice within the New Testament's confession gets harmonized in problematic ways, and then they're usually harmonized to whatever the dominant expression, right, of the church or the tradition that's speaking. So like you give the example of the ecumenical councils, they get harmonized so that when you hear those sermons, they're obviously settling whether or not the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son or not, and that kind of thing. When I don't know if Mark would ever lose sleep about that debate, but maybe John would care. So I wonder how. Well, maybe you could say this, like, what are some of the kind of a thrust of different Christologies that exist in the New Testament, and exactly how diverse do you think they get for people who regularly engage these texts, but from the lens and intuitions of their tradition, and then for those that feel like I could never say whatever that creed told me I was supposed to say. I find the New Testament gives you all sorts of canonized theological options that that are much more plausible in a sense to a lot of modern readers than particular interpretations of Middle Platonist metaphysics.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's very well said. This was part of how I sort of got into studying early Christology actually was even in the scholarly literature, and I think this is true maybe of kind of general, that it sort of trickles down to popular Christian understanding, the kind of thing with which I was familiar, was that the study of early Christology, of what the New Testament or early Christians, what they thought about the identity of Jesus, that what really matters about it is getting as quickly as you can to the question of whether Jesus is God or not, right? And that's basically the only question that's there. And in academic literature on Christology, the history of Christology, this is often talked about in terms of the high and low debates, right? High Christology versus low Christology. And there was a movement that came along sort of around when I was a student, of which your and my late colleague, Larry Hurtado, was an architect and leader. He had this group for which I don't have with me a whiskey tumbler that he gave me with these initials on it, the EHCC, Early High Christology Club. This was a project of Larry and a number of others who were arguing, especially in the 1990s into the early aughts, that contrary to some previous scholarship, which was very influential prior to that, sort of in the 1970s, 80s, and so on, said that basically the story of New Testament Christology is the early stuff is low and the late stuff is high, right? So that according to this hypothesis, Paul, who's at the very beginning, and then Mark, and also Matthew and Luke, have a low Christology, have a Jesus who's basically human, but a prophet or a miracle worker or a Messiah like King David or something maybe, right? And that very late, and they would date the Gospel of John late, right? Say, you get John at the end of the New Testament era, now finally endorsing what Christianity is concerned to endorse, which is a fully divine Christ. And what Larry Hurtado and others in this early high Christology movement argued was to say, actually, the high Christology comes, well, earlier, and he would point especially to something like Philippians 2, which doesn't say what John says, that Jesus just was God, or even that he was a God, but that he had a life before his human life, that he existed in the form of a deity or something. And that whatever that is, although it may not be Johannine Christology, it's not low Christology. It's not just that he's a deified human.
And for people that don't have their Bible memorized, what Matt's referring to is in Philippians 2, when Paul quotes a hymn to the church in Philippi, where he says, let the same mind be in you. And then I think most scholars think he starts quoting around then, same mind be in you. It was in Christ Jesus, who did not count equality with God something to be grasped, but humbled himself, taking the form of a servant, blah, blah, blah. Like, so you get that kind of three-stage Christology of eternal, pre-existent, incarnation, deep solidarity with materiality to the cross, exaltation, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow, tongue confess, that kind of thing. You can go back into what you're saying. Every time I let these things go, someone emails me and says, Tripp, not everybody was a sword drill champ.
Yes, no, that's exactly right. So Paul says in Philippians 2, Christ existed in the form of God or a God, then emptied himself, was humiliated in the form of a human, in the form of a slave unto death. And then God super exalted him, either to the same, or I think probably means to a higher place than he had previously, and gave him the name. But what's interesting about that is, among the letters of Paul is now almost universally regarded as an authentic letter of Paul, which means it's one of the earliest texts. It's earlier than any of the Gospels. But that means that it can't be the case that all early Christology is very low, right? And that only late do you get high. So anyway, I basically got irritated with these debates, although I have great respect for Hurtado's contributions in particular. But as a student, I got frustrated with these debates that seemed to me as if there are only two poles, low and high, and all you have to do is figure out, right, when Jesus lands where, and then you're done, right? And that seemed to me really deficient. And that along the lines of your question, the New Testament sources, not to mention other early Christian sources, are concerned to say all kinds of things about Jesus, not just how proximate to the high God he is, right? They want to say that he's, not just a prophet or priest or a king, but, well, a Messiah in particular, Savior, Lord, Lamb of God, all kinds of, all the classic titles, and other things that aren't titles, right? Just stories about him, or poems about him, or all those kind of things. And so it seemed to me, I said, I want to do something in Christology, to use the classic term, that isn't just kind of down the same rut over, low versus high, and, how high when. And so I do take a view that sort of and I do a class on this at New College in Edinburgh, an undergrad class on New Testament Christology, that I think is the most helpful way to think about it is to think of it as like a big map of all the different things that these earliest Christian writers wanted to say about Jesus, many of which are not the things that concerned necessarily the 4th century fathers of Nicaea, or necessarily the Protestant reformers, or many kind of the most familiar heroes from theological tradition. They were concerned to say things about Christ that were often just not the same things that the apostles or other early Christian writers were concerned. And so to study New Testament Christology is to say, what made these writers tick, right? Like, why is John so insistent on talking about Jesus's making himself equal with God, or him, being with God and God at the same time? And there's none of that in Paul, right? And yet, they're both dominant voices within the New Testament, and they certainly have lots of things they say in common about Jesus. But actually, if you take them on their own respective terms and don't assume they know each other, then it's also bizarre that they make as different claims as they do. And how does that work? And I think it's just that while they all do have actually, there are very few things that every New Testament text has in common with every other. They're quite few. But that mention of Jesus is one of them, and the name Christ also, and that's, or the title Christ, and that's really interesting. So, but to map New Testament Christology, I think, means to try to bracket out all the other texts and look at one at a time, right? Take Hebrews, which is a fascinating and to me one of the most difficult texts, and just say, what makes this tick? Why for him does Jesus have to be a high priest in the heavenly temple, when I think for no other New Testament text does he have to be that, right? And yet for Hebrews, nothing is more important than that. Now that's fascinating, right? Because that means that the kind of religious devotion to Jesus that Hebrews has is different in that fascinating respect from the equally fervent religious devotion that Paul has to Jesus, or that John has to Jesus. So you've got his priestly Christology. Revelation has a sometimes frightening kind of warrior Christology. Jesus will be an actually militant kind of warrior Messiah, which other New Testament early Christian texts take some of that imagery maybe in a more figurative kind of way. Less so Revelation, right? Paul has the militant language of Jesus, actually, but I think it's not exactly figurative. It's just, he thinks, the question is, who does the Davidic Messiah conquer? And I think Paul says that when Paul sort of makes a Gentile now a slave of Christ, that is Christ conquering them. So Paul actually keeps the kind of militant imagery from Isaiah 11 and other of these kind of royal Davidic messianic texts, but he applies them to his own job of kind of winning Gentiles for Christ.
One of the things that strikes me about that multiplicity question, as opposed to kind of moving beyond the pole of high and low Christology, which are like the conclusions, right? So you only ask if it's high or low because you know where the correct answer is and you need to figure out where it is in this kind of like binary scale. The New Testament, has this constellation of different images, and oftentimes the question that is being answered is not how high is it, right? So I think that there's that question, not that you can't ask it, but misses the existential register of confessions of faith. That in the early church, you can see in the Gospels how it gets narrated in the disciples, right? The disciples and the demons all know Jesus is the Christ for most of the gospel, but they don't know the content of it. So like when Peter says, Jesus is the Christ, Son of the living God, and Jesus is like, well, my heavenly Father revealed that to you. Right. So it's not like the other options. Who do they say I am? Elijah, John the Baptist with your head cut back on, a wandering cynic sage because the beads only line up to be read at the right time. Or, second Enoch said that Jesus is self-consciously the fulfillment of Israel in the personal body, or, whatever the historical Jesus or the historical answers kind of give. Peter's response is one that I think models something that's going on in Christology we miss if the New Testament functions to give us the conclusion to the one good question, as opposed it provokes this multiplicity of answers, and we're trying to figure out what the content of the confession is. So Peter knows Jesus is the Christ, but he also thinks it's dumb to go to Jerusalem because he's going to get killed. And that's kind of like basic to how Jesus was the Christ. Or you get in the synoptics, in Matthew and Luke, when you get the temptations of Jesus, the temptations kind of correlate to different ways, right? Jesus could have lived out his vocation as Messiah, and they're very different. And I think that one of the things that is helpful for moving beyond that binary of low and high is that you start to look at the way in which this confession, it shapes the form of life for Christians across the early church in its diversity, and can do for us today as people of faith. Because if there's only one good question, and it's whether or not whatever your tradition's privileged Christology answer is correct, then you got the wrong religion. Like, we don't even have like a perfect, final, internally coherent sacred text. We have a cacophony of different confessions. And as we learn more about their Jewish and Roman context and things, there's all sorts of beautiful insights and stuff that emerge. And it's a conversation that we're a part of rather than a set of conclusions to regurgitate faithfully in some, the ever-growing historical expanse of the church.
That the modern, even academic, like low versus high Christology thing, it is, in a way, it's sort of an inheritance of the heresiological discourse around Nicaea and so on, right? That, when push came to shove, there's one thing precisely that we want you to be able to say about Jesus. And to look at it that way is just to sort of like miss most of, a very great deal of what the New Testament texts are trying to talk about on their own terms, when that was not the controversy du jour, right? Except maybe depending on how you interpret some of these passages in John. And even if you take a really maximal reading of John's Christology, it's still not identical with Nicaea's Christology, let alone, 26 other books that are all obsessed with Jesus in a way, but in very different ways that aren't that. And yeah, I think you're right that there's a kind of an afterlife to that in subsequent Christian tradition, and that in particular, that defining controversy at Nicaea then sort of sets terms for lots of us, even many, many, many centuries later.
When I was doing my PhD, I worked at a very large church in Los Angeles for mainline Protestants. It was like 800, but I know that's a mega church for mainline Protestants, but not for evangelicals. But I did a number of different continuing ed things, and then I did a theological survey of the congregation and all sorts of stuff. And, it's fascinating, regardless of what ministers like to tell themselves, your congregation's full of people with a whole host of different Christologies. And I think we confuse ourselves that somehow people go to a church because they think the staff is so brilliant. And this is even true of, your students at a university. But the thing that struck me is that the New Testament, even just the canonized Christologies, are so much more diverse than what most congregations, regardless of where they are, tolerate. And there's a certain gift, I think, in the tradition that we canonized a host of different answers that are definitely situated in different communities at different points in the life of the early church. And instead of going, we need a high quality harmony gospel. We need Jesus to cleanse the temple like John at the beginning of his ministry and then do it at the end. We need a sermon on the plain and a sermon on the mount, because sometimes it's more material and sometimes it's more spiritual, right? Like you could just imagine, like, we would want that because he could point at it and be like, believe this. But we actually have like this multiplicity canonized. And in doing these, this project on, theological surveys of the congregation, there were, after it, I intentionally tried to preach. I did a sermon series where I tried to preach the Christology of all four gospels. And I used kind of like the baptism seen in Mark, the two birth narratives in Matthew and Luke, and then the, Johannine, the big Logos passage, and just said, like, all of these are in here and none of them said the Trinity yet. Right. So when you say this, like, maybe you can manage baptism is cool, Spirit descends, but at the end of it, he's like, I used to call you Abba, but now I don't know. Right. Like Mark. But it was amazing how many people are there in the life of the community trying to live out their deep commitment to the God they've encountered in Christ. And on most days they can muster some resonance with Mark. And it became like a real liberative experience for people in the congregation. And, out of that was kind of my interest in figuring out ways to introduce the cacophony of New Testament Christologies. Because a lot of people may feel like, I can't say what I'm really thinking and feeling and intuiting and confessing when they actually have canonized allies.
Yeah, it's completely coincidentally. I had an email this week of a kind that I sometimes get from folks interested in early Christology. So this guy had read something I had written about 1 Corinthians 8, which is, it's the idol meat passage. But there Paul says, well, an idol's not a thing. And he said, we know there's no God but one, and an idol is nothing. But he says, but on the other hand, there are many gods and many lords, But then he says, for us, there's one God the Father and one Lord, namely Jesus Christ. That's one of these passages where I think significantly in Paul makes a move very different from what John would do. And the only person he calls God is the Father. And Jesus is the Son of God, not God. And I mean, that's just an exegesis of that passage. And I had sort of pointed this out in print somewhere, and someone said, the guy who wrote me an email said, now, wait a minute, could I be a Trinitarian? But if this passage exists, can I still be a Trinitarian? Was the question, right? And I said, well, of course you can, because, I mean, at least as I would understand it, like, you don't have to be so, like, immediately tied to, the one particular text, such that if I could show you what I think is true of that passage, that Paul sort of is precise about not calling Jesus God there, but calling him the Son and calling him the Lord, and so on. Yeah, that sort of shatters that whole thing. I said, because it's not a coincidence, I think, that fourth century Christologies that were really concerned about defining the relation of substances between Father and the Son, they go to John a lot more than they go to Paul. And no surprise, in a way, right? Because it's more grist for their mill there. But this is part of the function of a canon, is that the different texts can say different things, and they're all part of the tradition. And then the tradition could sort of taps into them at different times and places, depending what it needs. So, to this guy who I think, wanted to be able to say he's a Trinitarian, but was troubled by 1 Corinthians 8, right? I said, well, I'm not telling you can't be a Trinitarian. I'm just saying, Paul doesn't say here everything that Nicaea says, and it's not a coincidence that Nicaea looks elsewhere than to 1 Corinthians 8 for some of these things. The canon is much bigger and wilder and woollier than almost any kind of creedal statement is, by definition, right? Because what creeds and confessions do is they boil things down, and they isolate exactly what must be confessed. Whereas the form that the New Testament takes it's this collection of stories and letters and poems and visions and that say all kinds of stuff. In other words, its format it's the opposite of kind of boiling things down to
Mm-hmm.
these common denominator claims. It's saying all kinds of things about, what the different authors think about Jesus. And in as much as the church, as you say about the gospel harmony, example, in as much as the church opted to hang on to the whole thing,
Mm-hmm.
Then that whole strange and wild collection of stories is always there to sort of push back against, later efforts at boiling things down.
When I've been in conversations with people real insistent that I just end up admitting, whatever Nicaea said, I just call them a Tatianite because he had a harmony gospel and he was condemned as a heretic, even though the details are only half connected to the harmony gospel. He was condemned, but in principle, he was a heretic and he made a harmony gospel. And nowadays, you don't need a harmony gospel. All you need is a Schofield Bible Index, and it will do all the work for you. And all of a sudden, you need a chart to work out your contemporary foreign policy because of random Bible passages. One of the things that about the New Testament, like how Christology works in the New Testament, is how does that conversation, right? Like if you start to open up what's going on there, how does that conversation shaped and impacted by the emergence of Jesus followers into something kind of growingly distinct from Judaism after the destruction of the temple? So is like when you think of the kind of, popularly called like how Jesus became God or whatever story, what's the role of kind of the dominance of Jewish members of the church early on to then the growth of Gentiles to then the destruction of the temple and things like, how does that shape it and impact it?
The old answer to that question that sort of I read in like textbooks and stuff before Larry Hurtado and the early High Christology Club and all that was that basically, right, when Christianity was very early and all Jewish, then Jesus wasn't yet God. He was a Messiah or a prophet or something like that. And then when Gentiles took over, they turned him into a god or something like that. And that doesn't work. It's much too quick and dirty to be true because, there are early texts like Philippians where Jesus is already some kind of superhuman, has some kind of superhuman existence prior to his human life. And because I think there's a lot more recognition now that it's not the case that sort of early Jewish texts are all very sort of proper, demure monotheists, and then it's Gentile texts that are, have crazy polytheism. There's lots of really interesting recent research on this. I mean, one of the best one-liners summarizing mountains of research that she's published is Paula Fredrickson has a line that says, in antiquity, even the monotheists were polytheists. Even ancient Jewish texts, many of which have a rhetoric about monotheism, nevertheless will talk about, as even Paul does, there are many gods. There are, in fact, many gods, right? This is something I've spent some time working on. It actually is a kind of theological problem for some ancient Jewish texts to say, okay, what is a Gentile god? Is it nothing? Is it a statue and nothing else? Is it a demon that they mistake for a god? And that's what the Greek Psalms say, actually, that what the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice not to God, but to demons.
And that's connected to Paul's idol meat stuff that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, so that's right. Because then in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul quotes that Greek psalm. He says, what they sacrifice to demons. So there he's riffing on what the psalmist says, that Gentile gods are real things. They're just like kind of lower, kind of JV gods, because demon or daimon in Greek just means kind of a lower deity, not necessarily like an evil, a monster or something. But basically the God of Israel is the high God. The Gentile gods exists, but they are daimons. They are sort of lower ones or something like that. Anyway, the upshot of that, of Fredrickson's argument that in antiquity, even the monotheists are polytheists, is that Jewish and Christian texts could say all kinds of really outstanding things about Jesus being divine, superhuman in interesting kinds of ways. So the fact that by the 2nd century, a lot more Gentiles are saying these things as opposed to Jewish apostles doesn't mean that for the first time now they're making claims about Jesus that were unthinkable before, because these kinds of things were thinkable even in inner Jewish terms. But I mean, this, the so-called parting of the ways, or the fact that by, in Paul's day, most of the people doing the talking and leading the movement are Jewish apostles themselves. Contrast, just a century later, by the time of Justin and Marcion and Valentinus and others, like it's basically Gentile Christians are where our sources come from. Right? I think they become more demographically dominant, and they're the people writing the books. So the foremost symptom of that, as respects Christology, is the fact that, right, ancient Judaism abides as a flourishing religion in its own right. And there's, despite some ancient Christian prophecies that, after the fall of the temple, God would judge the Jews for rejecting Christ, and that would be the end of Judaism. Like, that's not true. It wasn't true then, and it, never became true eventually, right? Judaism abides as a living religion. And the fact that early Christians had taken that confession that Jesus is the Christ, from what was originally a Jewish context, then all of a sudden there's like an ever-present sort of counter-argument to the Christian confession of Jesus. And this is what you get beginning especially in Justin Martyr's dialogue and in the whole contra Judaeos, against the Jews tradition of Christian writing, is Christian writers trying to rationalize or explain to themselves how they can stand by the claim that Jesus is the Christ when there are Jewish thinkers in their cities, in their own environs, who say, well, no, he's clearly not, because we know what the Messiah is, and that's not it. I mean, the most forcible form of that claim, which again goes all the way back to the 2nd century, is the counter argument that, well, when the Messiah comes, he'll bring the new creation, he'll bring the world to come, everything will be made new. So the kind of look out the window argument that the world is evidently not perfect, I think becomes a kind of ever-present sort of irritant to that Christian confession then, because ancient Christians couldn't just say, Jesus is the Christ, there, we proved it, it's done, because ancient Jews were in a position to think otherwise, right?
Yeah. Well, and theologians in the 20th century, that became a problem, the similar problem around that's where the birth of the ecumenical movement, that the lack of the unity in the church testifies to the kind of a problematic nature of divine revelation. And then that gets intensified with relationship with Israel after the Holocaust. So that's fascinating. Someone should, there's a rather fun cross-disciplinary history book of like how the 19th and 20th century, the Jewish-Christian relationship through the 19th and 20th century shaped the big transitions in biblical studies and theology. And you get like in that moment, theologically, you get like Rosenzweig in Jewish thought and kind of the neo-Orthodox movement theology. But anyway, that wasn't the question I was going to ask. I want to know, did Paul abandon monotheism or Judaism? Honestly, I feel like that's high quality. That's like clickbait worthy. And the fact that it's the title of an article in an academic text is just impressive.
Yeah. So I argue that, in a recent article and in this bigger book project that will be forthcoming soon. So I argue that Paul does not abandon Judaism, and that in order for him to sort of be this first really productive apostle of Jesus, sort of contrary to a long assumed Christian logic, like for him to say what he says about Jesus doesn't mean that he has to have abandoned Judaism. But it's because of this tradition that comes later, where Christians explain to themselves who they were by differentiating themselves from Jews and Judaism. And then they looked backward to Paul as sort of their prototype, and through a sort of creative mashing up of the story of the conversion of Paul in Acts with what Paul himself says, he came to be viewed as a prototypical convert, which is a term he never uses himself, nor does he say that he left Judaism for anything. And of course, famously, he never uses the word, no New Testament writer uses the word Christianity. That's a 2nd century term.
Are you saying that somewhere in Acts isn't a sermon where he goes, how Saul became Paul? Because I would swear that's somewhere in Acts. I've heard it enough times.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I've argued. Well, there's an interesting sophisticated discussion about the extent to which we moderns might call what he doesn't call what he experienced a conversion. I tend to be on the side of those who think it's not the best term, but even those who still say that will say, well, it's like an inner religious conversion, like someone, like a Baptist who becomes a Catholic or something. It's not like someone leaving the big tent altogether for an entirely different tent. So, and then on the monotheism side, I argued along the lines of what I was saying about 1 Corinthians 8-10, that Paul doesn't abandon monotheism, which is one thing that some, ancient and down to modern Jewish and now, Muslim and other critics have said about Christianity, that it wants to say that it's monotheistic, but it's not really, because you can't have a Trinity and be monotheistic. I mean, there's the issue that you and I have been discussing, that, the Trinity as such is a gloss on the New Testament. It's not something expressed in the New Testament. But also, the idea we have of monotheism is basically not native to the ancient world, including Jews and Christians, right? Like ancient people, including Jews and Christians, assumed like a really populous heavens, including, even if you're talking about your own tradition, your own, meaning if you were Paul or Jesus or whatever, there's God, but there's also angels and demons and spirits and powers and principalities and so on, and even other things called gods, explicitly in Paul, as in John and Philo and others. And so neither Paul nor other ancient Jews were as monotheist as we think when we use that term. But it also means then that it's not as if Paul dragged an original monotheist Jewish faith into paganism, because there is no bright line between, well, paganism is itself a slur, a late ancient Christian slur, right? These are all ancient Mediterranean people with, their own gods and indigenous traditions, but also, a kind of broadly shared common sense cosmology.
Today, paganism is a category of Instagram influencer.
That's right. So I hear. Yeah, that's right. I would have loved it, sure.
So when you think of kind of Paul negotiating those boundaries, and so like in one sense, if you ask like the monotheism question, and then you put him not in today's context, but in his own, the question of monotheism is, well, it's complicated if you're using our contemporary one. And you just on the things you meant, like that there's kind of layers of spiritual entities. When we ask that question today, like, are you a monotheist? Most people hear it kind of been so shaped by Enlightenment epistemologies that they have an ever-present kind of reductive scientific naturalism. And now we have the world. And they're like, you're a monotheist. And so our whole framework for when we say monotheistic is like, some monotheisms say God is the source and order of our naturalistic, materialistic, rather flattened world. Others that, like God is the future of that. I mean, there's all these ways, but all of them have the singularity of monotheism. Either like uphold or hold over the natural world. And that type of monotheism, so H. Richard Niebuhr called it radical monotheism as a way of kind of like getting at that type of monotheism is not what's being referred to in Second Temple period. People are listening. There was a long conversation about Philo in the James McGrath interview a while back about all the different types of Jewish monotheisms. But I just find that really fascinating that like something like monotheism or conversion, right? We then essentialize the present moment's experience and then project it back on other people. We do that so many times. And this is like outside of just religion, right? There's so many ways we essentialize our own experience of being ourselves in different categories, project it on others, and then demand them to fit into our categories because we're trying to make sense. And one of the gifts of the critical study of any religious tradition, in your Second Temple period Judaism, is that you're invited to take seriously the lived experience of others in other contexts. And that becomes a means for opening up the possibilities in the present. When it goes to monotheism, I think one of them is we picture the world everyone's got their like inner human Kant, and they don't know it, you know?
Yeah.
Even though he has a really cool statue next to New College, that one toe that's super shiny because people rub it, and it kind of creeps me out. Does that not creep you out that everybody rubs that one toe on Hume?
Maybe someday you or I will have a statue with a toe that's rubbed going to exams.
If I don't want my toe in a statue, and I definitely don't want people walking by rubbing my toes so it's differentially shining. Like that, there's so many things wrong with that, and I don't want to have to edit things out in a significant way, so I'm not going to ask a follow-up, but
yeah. Okay. I monotheism may be one of those terms. I mean, I actually, as a rule of thumb, I don't use it when speaking of antiquity. Fredrickson, who I mentioned to you before, she argues like it's one of those terms that's so potentially misleading when used of ancient texts that it's better not to use it at all. Others, like James McGrath, is good on this. I think, like he says, well, okay, let's define it in ancient terms, but then he shows, I mean, pretty formidably, I think, that if you define it relative to ancient terms, then even the Christology of John is still monotheistic in ancient Jewish terms, right? So to do that, then he has to do this work of kind of trying to make sure you always remember that when he says monotheism in antiquity, it doesn't mean what you're describing, like kind of post-Enlightenment assumptions. So you either do what McGrath does, or you do what Fredrickson proposes and just avoid the term, right? Which is it's the more economical solution, maybe.
Do you think this is tangentially related, but it's one of my in lockdown things I've spent too much time doing that wasn't really important to do, but I've had like 3 different things where I presented about my book, which was Christology, but not New Testament. There's one chapter about it, but then people, give you their responses. And after like 15 people spend time criticizing you, you then get self-reflective, and there's a narrative I use that I thought was good about development of Christology in biblical tradition that now I don't know if it's that accurate. It's really disturbing me. So now I want to know what you think about it, because you don't even have to believe what you say, Matt. All you have to do is be like, that's not that bad. And then I'll go back to repeating it with gusto. Okay. It's really around how the understanding of the Messiah or the day of the Lord. There's a number of different images in Second Temple period Judaism that shift for looking at how God shows up to remedy or respond to the predicament. And different scholars emphasize different things, but be it kind of Roman occupation of Israel or whatever. And in the prophetic tradition, it's still there was a kind of assumption that a cycle of responsiveness between the people of God and the call of God could generate the type of fidelity that leads to covenantal faithfulness and transformation or such. And in apocalyptic literature, you get a growth of imagery and poetics where God has to take a different type of responsibility than with the prophet for the people, like a type of apocalyptic intervention of such. And I connected that change also to the shift in the problem of evil in Hebrew and intertestamental literature, because a few Jewish scholars did. And then I was like, this is good enough. This is how systematic theologians work, man. I don't know if you've experienced this. I know you're reading Moltmann recently. You probably had this feeling. Then you're like, look, people that do this, I could footnote them. So let me roll, But my question, how apocalyptic literature function in thinking of the shifting of the understanding of New Testament Christology, was it you get this expectation, right, that the good God who made a good world can't set things to right by someone's listening ears working, right? Like the prophet and then the people of Israel. God has to get invested and involved in a particular way. And so that's the context for understanding Jesus's own internalization of the call of God and his own fidelity. So it then gets set in this apocalyptic context where his own fidelity nests the inheritance of the covenantal system. And enough biblical scholars give me such a hard time, Matt. And then one said, I'm not surprised. It gave me a hard time and said, but just hear that for a theologian, you've done such more attentive work to what we actually think. I want to just honor that and tell you, perhaps. I don't even know what to do with that.
So what did your Bible scholar critics, did they say, no, that's too strong a distinction between the prophetic and the apocalyptic? Or they said, no, there's not just two, there's 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different patterns? Or what was the...
Well, I got a multiplicity, but see, I was not trying to like space the whole thing out. My whole point was that, and this is just is how a philosopher of religion type person thinks, is that your religious sphere or poetics or whatever way you engage the world as mediated by a tradition with its mythopoetic structure, its rituals and all this kind of thing. If that structure or that sacred canopy, if you use like something like Peter Berger's imagery, is the fruit of God's covenantal relationship with the people, fidelity, infidelity, and all that kind of stuff, then the community's responsiveness in the prophetic tradition is saying, like, can't you be faithful in new and deep ways? The apocalyptic structure is like, man, I'm not optimistic about this. God's going to have to kind of, rupture this in some sort. You see the apocalyptic structure of the New Testament modified in ways where, the day of the Lord, as opposed to a type of, collision, you get the first fruits image and all that kind of overlapping of the ages type stuff. And so my thought was that the fidelity of the person Jesus to the one he called Abba wasn't an intervention in, like, if you think Christology, like incarnation by intervention, God's ability to call or him to fidelity was already thematized and shaped by the inheritance of the people of Israel. And when I do it, I always joke and say, like, he had a mom that sang the prophetic verses of 2nd Isaiah while he was in the belly, right? As my shout out to the Magnificat and this type of thing. And what I was trying to do is say that one of the images of Jesus is Jesus, the image of the invisible God. So how do you get incarnation without divine invasion? Is that the possibilities that are available to any person are always filtered and shaped by their culture. As the culture becomes a growing product of the divine and human relation, and then you get greater investment of God covenantally in Abraham and Sarah, and that whole history, then there's a growing investment that's available to the people of Israel over time. Just in the same way, like the first time we met, I'm trying to fill you out because I just finished talking to some New Testament PhDs that were super fundamentalists. And I was like, are the New Testament professors at Edinburgh all fundamentalists? And then I go to staff meeting and meet you and Helen. I'm like, I don't think so. So, okay, that's good to get that off the list. And because you relate to someone, the growing time, you get this growing awareness, and then it shapes what the next moment is. Anyway, if that's how you imagine covenantal faithfulness, then that whole story of the history of Israel becomes a way of thinking about God thematizing God's self in the context of a committed relationship and Israel understanding its identity over time. The apocalyptic move from the prophetic is the need for an instantiation of divine investment that doesn't necessitate a communitarian fidelity that the prophet asked for. And so in that context, I talk about how the person of Jesus inherits the history of Israel, and through his full faithfulness as fully human person, he then materializes, right, or makes imaged the image of the invisible God. But it's not an inbreaking that breaks through. It's actually I use the image from the Didache, the fruit of the vine of David, that he's inheriting the fidelity over time. It shakes the sacred canopy, which shapes his responsiveness. And, but the turn, and it's not very long in the book, but multiple New Testament scholars are like, I'm not sure, Tripp. That allows me to do something I believe metaphysically. So, like, was that the apocalyptic imagination, footnote in John Collins, plenty, was one that thought the necessity for the goodness of God to be reflected in creation is one that could not be a call and response to communitarian fidelity. And so that was the context for thinking about the fidelity of Jesus. That was a really long ramble. Sorry, Matt. That you asked a question, and I'm bad at asking short questions to begin with, and then
I would say several things. One is that's not the way you phrased the question initially. I would say that's not that bad.
Not that bad. I like that better. That's what I'm talking about.
It's a very complicated question. What a philosophical theologian like you owes to biblical scholars at all, because I mean, a thoughtful and responsible use of biblical texts, I think, is a manifest good in theological thinking. But there's no rule that says that you can only make moves that historical critics will sign off on, or something like that, right? But I mean, that basic distinction between a prophetic and apocalyptic outlook, the people who work directly on it, of whom I'm not one, right, will. There are plenty of people who challenge it or endlessly qualify it or something, but I mean, some basic distinction between the main lines that you see in the classical prophets in the Bible, and then what you see beginning in like Daniel and 1 Enoch and in the Apocalypses, 4 Ezra and 2 Baruch and so on. That distinction is not nothing. There's something there. The one other thing I'd say on that issue is, I mean, as you mentioned, this comes up a lot in Pauline studies, where I spend a lot of time working nowadays, and that right, Paul is often invoked as a classically apocalyptic thinker in this respect, in that he said what's necessary is, what J. Lewis Martin calls in his Galatians commentary the apocalypse of God's Son, that an entire new creation, not just a sort of mending of what's broken, but something much more radical. So it's a commonplace in Pauline studies for people to say, aha, see, Paul, in more or less continuity perhaps with Jesus or other New Testament writers, attests more this apocalyptic motif, something, a kind of more radical eruption or something like that. So I'll only speak about the thing I know best, but I have come to think about the case of Paul. In this new book, I'm arguing against, it's a super common in books on Paul, you hear people say Paul's anthropology was far more pessimistic than most of his contemporaries, right? Because they might have hoped that, God's people's heart would turn and they would, repent, and he would restore their fortunes and so on. But Paul says that they're all hopelessly wicked. And so the whole point of the Christ gift is that it has to sort of like reboot everything because people are so very bad. I've come to think in my reading of Paul, and actually I think there's this claim is pertinent to bigger questions about ancient Jewish and Christian eschatologies, that actually the kind of what makes Paul tick is not that his anthropology is that pessimistic, but that it's much more optimistic than people often grant, in that while Paul does think that people, Gentiles in his letters have to be like reconstituted by the divine spirit, like transformed into different beings than they are, it's because he thinks that the end game is not just like, a kind of a restoration of the nation of Israel with Gentiles now, bringing it tribute or obeying properly or something like that. The end game, to Paul's mind, is like an escape from the cycle of mortality and existence in, pneumatic spiritual bodies shining like the stars, as he says in Philippians. It's a kind of astral transformation of humanity, right? And there's a very good recent book on this by Matthew Thiessen called Paul and the Gentile Problem, that on a lot of these points I think is pretty spot on. That says actually Paul has no problem with the law of Moses or any of his ancestral tradition as being some kind of deficient religion or anything like that. This goes back to my point about Paul not abandoning Judaism. But he believes what some, but not all ancient Jews and ancient Christians believed, that the eschatological endgame was going to be not just sort of the natural world restored, but like a transhuman existence, a pneumatic heavenly existence, which Paul thinks kind of plausibly that's not what the law of Moses set out to do. The law of Moses set out to legislate for a flourishing human life in the land of Israel. And I would say, Paul says the law of Moses is pretty damn good at that. But Paul expects, when he says new creation, he means like the imminent reconstitution of everything, including human beings. And that, he says, the law of Moses doesn't do because it doesn't try to do. Right?
Yeah.
That's the job of the Messiah. So it's actually, so if you want to say Paul's apocalyptic, it's because he's an optimist, not a pessimist. It's because of the end game for him is something a lot more than a right-running temple cult and Israel no longer being dominated by the Romans.
Yeah, that's actually, that's really shocking. I mean, it makes sense to me. And part of that is because Paul draws so many analogies between the constitution of the Christian's faith and Abraham's. And if you just think about at least the way Second Temple period Jewish people understood the shift of human consciousness upon entering into a covenant with Yahweh, then it's not shocking that a new covenant, which is anticipating a new heaven and new earth, or a new way, it is a new way of being human, right? Like there's if you just look at Genesis 1 through 11 and then it gets to 12, there's like this big shift. And the big shift involves the kind of scandal of particularity to invest in a particular people to respond to a universal problem that, Babylon and such kind of the Tower of Babylon stuff kind of sets up. Like it's ratcheting it up to then make the particularity about a particular person. And then he expands the horizon of it to not just the people of Israel, but to, like you get second Adam and first fruits in the all. I mean, that makes sense. But, I was a Calvinist so much early on in life. I've just spent my whole life responding to its rather low anthropology. So I might be just predisposed to want to retweet you on this.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's an interesting kind of like, it's like the duck rabbit picture. Like it's easy to read Paul's letters and say, oh my gosh, this guy he can sound like a caricature of a Calvinist view, like humans are worms and just, but actually, if you look at kind of what he keeps pointing to, it's that he thinks actually humans are capable of having the form, being transformed, right, metamorphosed into the form of the heavenly Christ, an actual heavenly existence. One more thing I'll say about that you mentioned when God meets Abraham in Genesis 12, this is one of those, I mentioned a few moments ago, my friend Matthew Thiessen wrote this book. So Thiessen gives this reading that I think is right. I hadn't seen it before. I think it's right. He says that Paul reads God promising Abraham, right? God says to Abraham, go look up at the stars. And the part of the promise that Paul quotes is God says to Abraham, so shall your seed be, which back in Genesis, God says, count them if you can, so shall your seed be, as if it's about number. But all Paul quotes is that God says, like the stars, your seed shall be. And Thiessen argues that means Paul thinks God promised Abraham that his seed, his descendants, would be immortal, like the stars are immortal. Not that they would be many, but that they would be qualitatively. And that's what the giving of the pneuma or spirit is all about.
So that's a shift from like a quantitative referent to a qualitative one. And so the stars are the eternal referent, not the like the multiplicity of stars.
Yeah. And if that's right, then this is what I mean by Paul's kind of anthropological optimism. It's that he's not content to settle for people just stopping being disobedient and being better mortal people, right? That he actually expects that the Jews as a kind of birthright, because God promises to Abraham, and Gentiles, in as much as they are in Christ, will be like the angels and no longer like people of dust anymore. And that's just a really different picture than you get if you read it through sort of, again, that's caricatured Calvinist spectacles of that he's just kind of self-flagellating all the time. Miserable. In fact, he's got these almost, I think they're kind of almost Origenist ideas about transhuman existence in the eschaton. So,
well, Origen's my favorite early church father, if you count him. James said he'll come on the podcast, so we can have him fix everyone's Calvinist caricature if he can muster it. But so there are a few quick questions people sent in that are members of Homebrew Christianity. They said, Matt's been there a while. What is his favorite whiskey? You've been in Scotland for a while. If you have your friend coming, maybe Matt's coming, and he's going to come give a paper about Paul's very optimistic anthropology to see if he can trigger James in the audience at New College. And afterwards, you're like, I'm going to get you two to work this out. And you don't even have a budget. You get whatever budget you want for favorite whiskey. What's it going to be?
Oh man. Well, no budget. If I'm buying an expensive dram, I'm really partial to the Old Pulteney 17 or 18. Actually, I haven't seen a 17 in a while. Old Pulteney 17 or 18. Yeah. I have a bottle of the 18 my brother gave me for a very expensive gift that I'm slowly working through. So Old Pulteney. And a more standby, the Kilkerran.
Okay. So next question is, what is one book you were assigned while you were a student that you actually read the whole thing and have read again since then?
Oh, goodness.
And the trick for me on this is it's not assigned again, but read again. Like you actually had to look at all the words a second time.
From when I was a graduate student, I can think of several. From when I was an undergrad, that's fewer. From when I was an undergrad, I was assigned and have since reread Schleiermacher's Speeches.
Praise the Lord.
Lindbeck's Nature of Doctrine, Harnack's Essence of Christianity. Those are the ones I can remember having gone back to. Yeah.
Oh, now that is an interesting trinity if there ever was one.
Yeah.
Schleiermacher, Harnack, and Lindbeck.
Yeah. But there it is. But, yeah, to the best of my memory.
Okay, so what is N.T. Wright's worst idea? Or if you got to talk to him to argue about something, right? Because you're both nice. Y'all probably would sit there the whole time. I like coming up with all the stuff you agree on, but I was sent a video of you by one of the homebrew members where you responded to Tom when he was at school, and they were like, I cannot tell what he disagreed with, but it was he obfuscated all his disagreements for 15 minutes.
That's funny. Yeah, that was a diplomatic response, I think. So that's, yeah.
To Paul, it was to his Paul volume is what you were responding to, but
yeah. Well, here's one thing I would say. I think it's wrong to write longer and longer and longer books. I'm one of those who I think that so there's one book of Tom Wright's especially that I still like, talking about what what you were assigned that you still go back to. His very first book of essays on Paul, like I think pretty soon after his PhD, The Climax of the Covenant. I disagree quite substantially about some of his core readings of Paul, but that is a really good book. Even when it's wrong, I think it's a really good book. And but it's a very disciplined book. It's a book by a relatively junior scholar who's got a lot to prove, maybe, or something. Mm-hmm. So I think actually that kind of like economy of words and like I think if his later stuff were more like that, it would have fewer flaws than it does.
I don't know how long ago it was, but like this past week was the 13th year of Homebrewed. And so there was one year I interviewed like all the New Testament historical Jesus scholars. So like, Borg and Crossan and N.T. Wright and Bart Ehrman and like a whole bunch of them. And I made a list of like 10 New Testament scholars, and it was like, this is speed round. Just say the first thing that comes to your head. And their ability to have rather quick dismissive responses or like very strategic affirmations of their peers was impressive. Theologians couldn't do that. Okay. I did it with Marcus Borg, and then I joked with N.T. Wright about it. He's like, well, what was the list? And I was like, hold on, I'll get it. And then he does it. And then I was like, well, apparently New Testament scholars have like short quips on all their peers. A theologian's like, if you were like, oh, Joshua Ralston, who's on staff with us, I would like take me a while before I said anything negative, even though he's really wrong about lots of stuff, Anyway.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe it was that generation of New Testament scholars who were quicker with the ready-made criticisms than I don't know.
Well, I think there was like a New Testament bubble with the Jesus seminar. Then all of a sudden, every weekend they were getting paid significantly to show up at different places to say stuff. So you gotta work that response time.
You might be right about that. Yeah.
You're just waiting. You're like, when do I get my beads? I might get you some. You just wait till your birthday, Matt. I might show up with some colored beads, and all of a sudden, like post vaccines, you're just gonna be flying all over the globe. You're like, I brought my beads. I got quick quips. Kids got to go to college. All right. So, last question. You're working on Paul right now. What's the question you didn't have when you started the book that you have now?
I thought I knew what Paul meant by Christ is the end of the law in Romans 10 when I started. And then I came to the view that I did not know what that meant. And I've ended up with a completely different kind of argument than I imagined I was going to have going into it. Classic text on one of these, a kind of core problem in understanding Paul. And I started a book thinking I was going to have one interpretation of it, and I've ended up throwing that out and going back to the drawing board.
Ooh.
But yeah.
There you go. That's like a teaser. A teaser. Now, thank you so much for hanging out. It's been a blast.
Yeah, that has been fun. Thanks, Tripp.
Oh, it's fun, and I didn't realize how long we talked. I'm getting text messages asking if I was making dinner, and I was like, I didn't realize how long I talked.
Yeah, I think I'm starting to get some of the same text messages.
Well, thank you, and we will hopefully see each other in person in the relatively near future.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Thanks. Congratulations. You made it to the end of this episode of Homebrewed Christianity. That means you're pretty cool. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to judge the people that didn't get here, but I might be. But you don't have to tell them because you made it. You're a nerd. You're a winner. Now, here's what I'd like for you to do to congratulate yourself. Think through your friends list and then say which one of them is a real dear theology nerd. Which one needs to hear this episode, and then share it with them. Sharing is caring. And when it's the brew, that's the best you can do. Enjoy.